Excellencies and Reverend Fathers and religious and ladies and gentlemen. As I mentioned in my UN talk yesterday, God knew that the Church would lose her temporal defender, the Holy Roman Emperor, in 1918, and so that's why he probably sent Our Lady to Fatima in 1917 to help the Church, tell the Church how to protect herself in this coming satanic New World Order. And why did Our Lady mention Russia by name? It's very significant. Well, less than a month after her last appearance in October of that year, 1917, the communists took over Russia. Now, Our Lady obviously knew that the founders of communism were Satanists, and Russia had been chosen to spearhead a ruthless system of world control, fueled by Satan's hatred of the Christian world order. And she knew that they would lead billions of souls to hell. So she came to warn us and give us the means of both physical and spiritual protection. In his 1958 book called Masters of Deceit, the FBI head, J. Edgar Hoover, recognized that communism is a religion. This is what he said. Communism is more than an economic, political, social, or philosophical doctrine. It is a way of life, a false materialistic religion. It would strip man of his belief in God and his freedom. Under communism, all would become slaves. America is now the prime target of international communism. End of quote. Well, communism is a religion. It's the religion of Satan. Because as I mentioned yesterday, communism is the invention of Freemasonry, and the god of the Freemasons is the devil. And I also mentioned that the Communist Manifesto was commissioned by the Illuminati to express Illuminati ideas, Masonic ideas. And that the goal of Masonry is a Lucifer-worshipping, socialist, one-world republic totally controlled by Masonry. In other words, the goal is to found and have the kingdom of Satan on earth. J. Edgar Hoover was a 33rd degree Freemason. So when he said that international communism was targeting America, he didn't reveal who was behind communism, because many prominent Americans were involved. The Cold War was a charade. It hid the fact that the errors of Russia were being spread with the help of the West. American and European bankers tied to the Illuminati secretly funded the Bolshevik Revolution and built up communist Russia and then the Soviet Union. And as we know, the United States has been working closely, and the Allies, with the communists, such as during World War II and through the United Nations. That's why Our Lady said that the only way to save the world from total enslavement was for Russia to be converted, which, as you've heard many times now, would only be through the collegial consecration of that country to her Immaculate Heart. In June 1929, she told Sister Lucy, the moment has come for the consecration to be done. And that choice of 1929 is also very significant, because it was precisely that year that Stalin started to mount a socialist offensive on all fronts. But the conversion of Russia is the last thing that the Freemasons want, as this would destroy their chief instrument for world control. So it's not difficult to figure out who's responsible for the myth that the consecration is done and that the changes in the USSR and Eastern Europe over the last 2 decades prove that Russia has converted. Because if the Church can be fooled into thinking that the consecration has been done correctly, then it won't do the consecration, and the Illuminati will be able to continue using Russia. But Our Lady cannot be blocked. In 1961, a high-ranking Russian KGB official and spy by the name of Anatoly E. Golitsyn defected to the United States to warn the West not to be fooled by changes in the communist bloc. For over 30 years, he provided very accurate analyses and forecasts of communist developments, and he gave these to the CIA. He also wrote 2 books to alert the public. The first one was published in 1984, and it was called New Lies for Old. See, New Lies for Old. And the second one was published in 1995, called The Perestroika Deception. Now, in New Lies for Old, Golitsyn described Lenin's strategy for achieving the one-world communist government with Western help. He also forecast the changes in the communist bloc, including the economic and political reforms, the rise of solidarity, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, and the planned collapse of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, in a 1990 interview for Time magazine, Gorbachev, who was the instigator of Perestroika, predicted the same changes. So he corroborated Golitsyn's allegations that they were long planned and were not due to spontaneous uprisings or to the efforts of President Reagan, Pope John Paul, or this Polish workman by the name of Lech Walesa. Golitsyn's second book, The Perestroika Deception, deals mainly with the final phase of the long-range strategy of deliberate deception that was hatched decades earlier. Golitsyn said he wanted to help people who believe in the death of communism to recover from their blindness. He described in great detail the confusion and errors that have been engendered in the world and in the church by Perestroika. His analyses exposed the very events that Our Lady of Fatima said would take place if the collegial consecration were not done. She said, nations will be annihilated. Golitsyn said that the West's failure to recognize that Perestroika is a treacherous ploy threatens the very continuation of Western civilization, as Perestroika is intended to bring about the political and physical destruction of Western democracies. His book, The Perestroika Deception, contains extensive documentation to prove that the changes behind the Iron Curtain were meticulously planned to follow Lenin's plan, Lenin's strategy for achieving with Western cooperation the new socialist world order. It's supposed to be an atheistic global society run by the Russians and Chinese by 2000 AD. Well, there were a lot of strange activities in celebrating that year, 2000 AD, and they seem to indicate that symbolically the New World Order was born in 2000. Currently, there seems to be a struggle over who will run it. Will it be America or the communist monster that it helped to produce? Is the child turning on its parent? Or is it all just a psychodrama, a play, acted out to generate international fear, with the solution being increasing totalitarianism? Now, as part of its geopolitical strategy, communism has perfected the art of mind control known as psychopolitics. One of its techniques is to implant a stimulus in the minds of a wearied population that will produce a desired response, and then to activate that stimulus whenever it's needed. So the specter of nuclear annihilation has been used on and off to manipulate the world to clamor for international controls and cooperation and international laws and policing, which is the way to world government. According to psychopolitical doctrine, quote, if a people can be conquered in the absence of war, the end of war will have been achieved without the destruction of war. The spread of communism is by conquest of the mind. In psychopolitics, we have refined this conquest to its last degree. If psychopolitics succeeds in its mission throughout the capitalistic nations, There will never be an atomic war, for Russia will have subjugated all of her enemies. Psychopolitics aims to change loyalties or destroy minds quickly. It also seeks to produce a maximum of chaos so that at last a weary populace can seek only in our offered communist state, at last only communism can resolve the problems of the masses and bring to earth through its worldwide state the greatest peace that man has ever known. That's a summary of the doctrine of psychopolitics. Perhaps the greatest success of psychopolitics was getting the world to believe that communism had collapsed at the end of the 1980s. Yet, as I mentioned, Golitsyn had predicted most of the dramatic events in his 1984 book, New Lies for Old, and it has been given a 94% accuracy rating. He was trying to convince the West that this was all part of the plan for world government. In his 1995 book, The Perestroika Deception, he demonstrates that perestroika was not a 1985 Gorbachev invention, but the final phase of a plan formulated during the years 1958 to 1960. Perestroika means restructuring, but not just of the Soviet system, but of the whole free world. It's the Soviet strategy for what it calls a second October revolution. It's meant to be a temporary, that's very important, a temporary, non-violent world revolution involving controlled fake democratization and disinformation. And the plan is to use these two techniques to bring about the synthesis of communism and socialism with capitalism, a restructured capitalism, into the communist one world order. Well, here we are 22 years after the start of perestroika, and we see that communism or its socialist twin have made great strides all around the world. Remember Hoover said that communism is a materialistic religion that strips man of his faith in God and removes his freedom. I think you will agree we have rapidly approached this point over the past 2 decades. The key to understanding psychopolitics and perestroika is to remember that inspiration is Satan, the father of lies. And the operating principle of communism was set down by Lenin, quote, "The lie is sacred, and deception will be our principal weapon." Well, this is taken directly from Voltaire, whom I spoke about yesterday. Golitsyn demonstrates that to fool Western populations into buying the concept of convergence with communism, Stalinism was restructured into a more attractive form of communist democracy, with the KGB playing a key role in implementing the strategy. They had 30 years of experimentation in controlled democracy in countries such as Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Romania. And this prepared the ground for the final phase, the restructuring through perestroika and the controlled false democratization of the USSR itself. Perestroika involves first restructuring the mind from anti to pro-communist thinking. And when that is successful, then governments, laws, financial systems, etc., can be easily restructured to enable a communist takeover. So perestroika is just another psychopolitical game of mind control. Its particular aim is to make communism look so benign that you might think it has converted or died. It uses the principles of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who lived from 1891 to 1937. Gramsci devised a new, improved model of Marxist-Leninism in order to fool the West. Gorbachev, who calls himself a Marxist-Leninist, was chosen to launch this perestroika. It's psychological warfare. One of its weapons is what Golitsyn calls cooperation, blackmail. And it's described as follows. A theatrical, that word theatrical is important, a theatrical display of democratism is designed to convince the West that a decisive break with the past has taken place. And so this encourages the West to work with, cooperate with the so-called former communists. At the same time, there's a blackmail threat of a return to the Cold War, or worse, if the West does not cooperate. So the play is meant to convince the public that a break with the past has occurred. That's the public, but Western governments have roles assigned to them in this play. Golitsyn shows how every crisis, from Tiananmen Square in China to the fake August 1991 coup attempt in Russia to the Chechen wars that followed, they all follow the cooperation blackmail formula. The pattern is always the same. The new forces of democracy are shown locked in mortal combat with the conservative hardliners. I'm sure you've heard these phrases. And the West is told that only cooperation will help the fledgling democracies to survive. So the communist price for peace is the restructuring of Western thinking and policies to obey the communists. The way the controlled fake democratization takes place varies from country to country depending on the various circumstances in the countries to be exploited. They exploit whatever is the circumstances in the country. And this was, once again, the plan of Lenin, as the following quotation shows. Now, when I give you this quotation, note that Lenin, who is the father of modern communism, equates democracy with socialism and communism. That is, democracy is socialism/communism. Bear this equation in mind when you hear Western powers or the UN say that they are going to war against a nation to install democracy in it. This might strike you as an arrogant idea, but it's more than that, because what they mean is that they're going to install communism. Now here's a quotation from Lenin. All nations will come to socialism, but all will not come in the same way. Each of them will bring its own traits into one or another form of democracy, into one or another variety of dictatorship of the proletariat, that's communism, into one or another rate of socialist transformation. So he quite clearly equated democracy with socialism and communism. In Poland, says Golitsyn, the specific conditions that could be exploited are related to the strength of the Catholic Church and of the trade unions. In East Germany, the specifics lay in the division of Germany into two states. He goes on to mention other countries. I'll get to China. In China, he said, the students have an old revolutionary tradition as the initiators of political movements and change. The Chinese Communist Party itself started as a student movement. Therefore, the party used students to pretend that even China was introducing democracy. And so he described what really happened at Tiananmen Square in Beijing to show the type of deception that is practiced and how wary we must be of what is reported in the media. The event took place in June of '89, just before the changes in Eastern Europe. And this is what happened according to Golitsyn. The initiators and the core of the student pro-democracy demonstration were the children of Communist Party officials. The demonstrators were not calling for a rejection of the socialist system or for the overthrow of the government. Banners read, "We firmly support the correct leadership of the Communist Party." Then suddenly, Western television coverage was cut off and the demonstration was suppressed. Probably, the original party-organized demonstration brought out genuine, spontaneous elements, and the situation threatened to run out of control. Was there a real massacre in Tiananmen Square? He asks. Many Western reporters covered the event from their hotel rooms. they were nowhere near it. How many actually saw the massacre? Published reports are conflicting. The New York Times, he said, disputed its first report and asserted that while troops were killing victims in the area around the square, there was no firm evidence that students were killed in the middle of the square itself, which is the common story we hear all the time. This would support the suggestion that the crackdown was aimed not at the original pro-democracy demonstrators, communist pro-democracy demonstrators, who left the square together singing the Internationale and who had been carrying placards supporting the Communist Party, but the crackdown was aimed at the unorganized elements. So in other words, there was a controlled, fake, pro-democracy demonstration, which seemingly then inspired some real demonstrators to come out, and they were suppressed. Now, the Cold War was also an acting out of the communist dialectic, which I mentioned yesterday pits a thesis against an antithesis. And the solution of the conflict is a synthesis or convergence of the two sides, moving them always closer to the communist goal. So the thesis in the Cold War was the free world. And the antithesis was communism, especially that of the Soviet Union, which is, you could consider, the mother country of communism. Since the Soviet Union was built by masonry, masonry could order it to play dead or change its spots when needed, and that's what happened in 1991. It was a major psychopolitical trick to trick the West into the synthesis or convergence. And it was even announced ahead of time. It also brought the Soviet republics closer to Lenin's idea of a federation of equal republics in a communist democracy, so it actually strengthened communism. According to Golitsyn, quote, one of Gorbachev's closest advisors had referred in 1988 to the forthcoming erosion of the image of the enemy. That would be the bad image of Soviet communism. If he had meant that the enemy itself was to be erased, he would have said as much, but he did not. Thus, the West mistook the image for the reality just as anticipated. It followed that the abolition of the image of the enemy would need logically to be accompanied by the disappearance of the Communist Party itself. Hence, the August 1991 coup attempt and its aftermath, which represented a break with the past, opening the way for convergence with the West. By contrast, since the West had not, since Nixon's détente with China, regarded China as the enemy, the reverse of this logic required no vanishing act by the Chinese Communist Party. In his 1990 interview for Time magazine, Gorbachev confirmed that the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was changing its image to look more democratic, but not to change course. This would make it more powerful and move communism forward. He said, the party has embarked on the path of profound self-reformation. It is making itself much more democratic. That is closer to Lenin's idea of communist democracy. But Gorbachev's use of the word democratic gave the impression that the fountainhead of communism, the Soviet Union, was on the verge of collapse. Making the party more democratic, he said, would enable it to be revived as a powerful, organized political force, and that will help to move Perestroika, that is the restructuring of the West, forward. He also stated the plan for the coming collapse of the Soviet Union and the formation of a new union which would more closely resemble Lenin's vision. Quote, this is Gorbachev now. When the USSR was born, Lenin was of the view that the Union should be a federation of equal republics, while Stalin favored a unitary state. It's only now that we are beginning to create a new union in the original sense, Lenin's sense, a truly democratic multinational state and the progress of Perestroika are mutually interdependent. A new union would differ from what we have now. There should be real sovereignty for the republics. And now he explains what he means by real sovereignty. That means a degree of freedom. He didn't say full freedom, a degree of freedom that would enable every people to feel that is in full control. Not to be in full control, but to feel that they're in full control of its land. There should be new relations between the republics and the center being Russia. So Gorbachev was clearly referring to restructuring the Soviet Union to make it resemble Lenin's idea of a communist democracy. And 18 months later, the USSR split into Lenin's federation called the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS. Golitsyn points at other strategic advantages for breaking up the Soviet Union. The first is that now there are more communist countries represented in and able to influence the UN, the EU, and international financial organizations. By 1994, he said, all the so-called independent republics, including the Baltic states, were controlled by communists within the fiefdom of Russia. This is the principle that comes from the Illuminati for deception's sake. It is the principle of dissolving and then regrouping an entity for a strategic purpose. As far as independence, Lenin himself used independence. He gave temporary independence to some republics in order to promote trade with the West. So this had been done before. Another reason for collapsing the Soviet Union was to gain control of Middle Eastern oil. The new democratic image of the Muslim republics is being exploited to develop alliances with Muslim fundamentalists in Arab countries so that pro-Western rulers in those countries can be replaced with Russian-controlled fundamentalists. And the US and Russia seem now to be battling for control in the Middle East. The US is trying to win Iraq and Afghanistan whilst arming other Middle Eastern states such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and so forth, as well as Israel. Russia has long supported Iraq and Egypt, and it's been selling nuclear technology and missiles to Iran. Challenging America's Sixth Fleet station in the Mediterranean, it is now re-establishing a Mediterranean naval base for warships in Syria, and it is selling missiles and fighter planes to Damascus, Syria. Russia also has friendly relations with the US-backed president of Palestine, as well as with the opposite anti-US Hamas movement, which recently seized control of the Gaza Strip. Golitsyn said the new Muslim republics are being used to channel nuclear weaponry to Iran, whilst Russia, which is the signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, looks innocent. And also because of Russia's democratic image, Turkey, which is a NATO member, was enabled to become a major partner of Russia and purchase Russian military equipment. So there's a lot of things going on from all directions. Now, also according to Antonio Gramsci's formula, Christianity has to be secularized and culture and morals corrupted for the revolution to succeed peaceably in the West. Gramsci said, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. Control of the Western mind is affected by controlling the media, changing the meaning of words, and destabilizing society through corruption. Are we surprised at that huge growth in corruption? With society thus deconstructed, the mind is confused and more open to collaboration with the enemy because it cannot recognize it as the enemy. Golitsyn demonstrates that the present strategy is a continuation of the new economic policy devised by Lenin in the 1920s together with Gramsci's improvements thrown in. As I said before, Lenin had said, deception will be our principal weapon. Just like today, Lenin's new economic policy was hailed by the West as a retreat from communism. But unlike today, the Catholic Church was not fooled. Pope Pius XI, in his 1937 encyclical on atheistic communism, warned that communism was not converting, but he was ignored. The new economic policy fooled the West into helping the Soviets and strengthening Russian communism. Stalin even showed some religious tolerance, and he dissolved the Communist International, but then his later repressions badly discredited communism and impeded its expansion. And so modern communists condemn Stalin, but that doesn't mean that they've broken with communism. It's just a means of fooling the West. So Khrushchev and Mao decided to abolish Stalinism and restore Leninism, which are basically two sides of the same coin. At the end of 1960, the long-range strategy based on Lenin's new economic policy was adopted by 13 communist countries, including China. Perestroika is the new phase of the strategy, a final push to conquer the West from within, using KGB-controlled dissidents, opposition movements, and disinformation about so-called liberals and conservatives, reformers versus hardliners, etc. According to Golitsyn, Gorbachev's other policy of glasnost, meaning openness, was meant to combine accurate information with disinformation. The KGB was to create and control communist officials of different political stripes, of so-called different political parties, to convey an image of democratic choice. KGB has changed its name several times, and that's just a ploy. It doesn't mean it's gone away. It's just a new name change. All the leaders since 1960 have been carrying out this new plan, and all their power struggles are staged. They love theater, and they certainly fool the West through it. KGB agents of influence have long infiltrated Western circles in order to change the thinking of the leaders of every part of society. Even many dissidents and diplomats are agents. Exchange programs and joint projects have increased Russian influence and recruitment. The UN in New York, I mentioned yesterday, is a great source of communist agents. Now, whilst forging bonds with Western liberals, agents also identify true anti-communists who are then neutralized by various means. They are ridiculed or slandered as enemies of peace, or removed from office, or assassinated. We don't have to look far for an example. I would say that Father Nicholas Gruner is a victim of the neutralization technique as used by agents within the church. He has been calumniated and physically attacked even in the very shrine of Fatima. Agents are sent to cause trouble at his conferences. And many other dirty tricks are used to sabotage them. Canadian priests and laity are instructed to shun him, and not merely him, but anyone at all connected with him. And all because he's trying to expose the communist takeover. A major communist penetration success is the establishment of Gorbachev as an agent of influence at the highest levels of Western society. According to Golitsyn, 4 months before the August 1991 fake coup attempt against him, Gorbachev established on American soil the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Officially, it was called the Gorbachev Foundation, USA. It was located in the Presidio, which is a disused military base in San Francisco. Later, it changed its name to the State of the World Forum. Then it became the Gorbachev Foundation of North America, located at Northeastern University in Boston. Gorbachev foundations also exist in Moscow, Italy, Canada, and the Netherlands, and they have many spin-off groups. The staged collapse of the USSR, with Gorbachev's seemingly forced resignation on December the 25th, 1991, get that symbolic date, December the 25th, enabled Gorbachev to start using his American branch of the Soviet Communist Party without raising eyebrows. He has used his American base and other organizations to mobilize the world's leaders in the cause of disarmament, convergence, and world government. And the motto of his foundations is toward a new civilization. Golitsyn demonstrates that the liberalization of Eastern Europe was meant to give the impression that communism was no longer a threat. This would hopefully lead to the dissolution of NATO, the American withdrawal from Europe, and a neutral socialist Europe, which Gorbachev and other communists call a common European home from the Atlantic to the Urals. You may have heard that phrase. Common in common European home means communist. It's just code for communist. Since the NATO doctrine states that the security of the Allies is provided by the strategic nuclear forces of the alliance, particularly those of the United States, the dissolution of NATO would lead to Western nuclear disarmament. But with NATO still existing, Plan B was to reduce its effectiveness by various means. The first is penetration. This has already taken place through various cooperative projects with former Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union members. Russia worked with NATO in Bosnia, and a permanent NATO-Russian Council was formed, with NATO agreeing to consult Russia on all decisions. These projects are a working form of convergence. Plus, they enable Russia to learn how NATO operates. Global terrorism, it enables them to do anything. It provided a convenient excuse for Russia's 2002 partnership with NATO. So it makes one wonder who was behind the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, especially since the 1989 Pentagon report made it clear that Russia was leading a worldwide network of terrorism aimed at the United States and its allies. One of its major projects was helping Palestinian terrorists. The first attack on the World Trade Towers took place only 4 years after the Pentagon report. But since communism had collapsed by then, no questions were raised about possible Russian links to the Islamic bombers. Then in 2006, last year, the Russian Navy joined NATO's counter-terrorist naval patrols in the Mediterranean. What better way to learn how NATO works? A second way to reduce NATO's power is by getting it to accept its former enemies as members. 10 Eastern European states have now joined. The Chechnyan barbarity, according to Golitsyn, strengthens the argument that Russia's neighbors need the protection of NATO membership. Moscow makes a lot of noise about this, but it's all a pretense, because such membership increases penetration, and in any case, NATO is now a partner with Moscow. Another way to reduce NATO's effectiveness is to reduce its originally purely military role of defending only its members. This has now been accomplished by using NATO as a peace enforcement force in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, which are non-members. These actions illustrate NATO's new role as an arm of a UN police force working for communist expansion, which is the UN agenda. As I said yesterday, NATO-Russian convergence is not surprising because it is all following Stalin's idea NATO was formed as a regional organization of the United Nations to help build support for world government. So now it's openly working with the so-called enemy, because the so-called enemy is dead. And so it can openly help the expansion of communism under the guise now of fighting global terrorism. Golitsyn shows that even the Solidarity trade union in Poland was planned by the communist bloc during those years, 1958 to 60. The Polish Communist Party formed the original core and leadership of Solidarity, whilst its leader, Lech Walesa, just cooperated with them. But having gained hero stature in the West, Walesa could now travel around the world and help broaden the communist base in trade unions. Walesa, who supposedly initiated the collapse of communism, should be a natural enemy of Gorbachev. Yet, he's been a speaker at several Gorbachev Foundation conferences on One World Matters. In New Lies for Old, Golitsyn describes Solidarity's role in deceiving the Catholic Church as well. I'll get to that in a minute. But with its job finished, the Solidarity government was extinguished and replaced with the communist government in 2001. Golitsyn also analyzes other world regions, but I'm just going to move ahead now to what he says about the Catholic Church. Religious relaxations and clerical agents of influence have helped to further restructuring of the Church. Russian Orthodox priests have been used by the KGB in order to promote cooperation between the Orthodox and Western Catholics and Protestants to help establish a united front for disarmament and convergence. Unfortunately, as I showed yesterday, Pius XII opened the door to communist penetration by allowing Catholics to fight on the side of Stalin during World War II. Then, in order to have Russian Orthodox observers at Vatican II, the Holy See promised not to attack communism. And that 1962 Vatican-Moscow Agreement, which is still in force, is a persecution of the Church. Why? Well, it has silenced the Church and allowed the errors of Russia to spread unchecked and unchallenged. Golitsyn says the visits of communist leaders to the Vatican, which started in 1967, give them credibility and opportunities for manipulation. He quotes an anti-communist Russian general who said, "Perestroika would not have been possible without a secret understanding between Gorbachev, Jaruzelski, and the Pope." Jaruzelski was the communist president of Poland until Lech Walesa took over in 1990. Golitsyn doesn't explain this secret understanding, so one can only presume it was a continuation of the Vatican-Moscow Agreement with the added twist of Perestroika's cooperation blackmail. In other words, something along the lines of Vatican silence about Marxism continuing would guarantee religious and civil liberalization starting with Poland. However, in 1990, Golitsyn warned that apparent religious tolerance has a hidden agenda. Quote, "The Vatican should reverse its mistaken support for the renewal of the communist regimes. It fails to understand that greater apparent official tolerance of religion is accompanied by a secret drive to increase party and KGB penetration of the Catholic and other churches and to use agents therein for political and strategic purposes. As part of the program to destroy religion from within, the KGB in the late 1950s, now there are other communists, former communists, who have come forth and said, no, not the 1950s, actually the 1930s, as far back as the 1930s, they started sending thousands of communists to ecclesiastical academies and seminaries to train them as future church leaders. As Golitsyn says, these young communists joined the church at the call of the Communist Party to implement its policy in the struggle against religion. The rise of liberation theology, the social justice church, and the feminist demands for equality in the church are fruits of this policy. According to Golitsyn, in the present phase that's now under Perestroika, secret agents in the Catholic and other churches are being used to implement communist strategy. Well, the extent of the deception regarding religious tolerance in Russia can be gauged by Gorbachev's comments to his colleagues, his communist colleagues, in 1987, which was 2 years after he launched Perestroika and supposed religious relaxations. This is what he said. There must be no let-up in the war against religion, because as long as religion exists, communism cannot prevail. We must intensify the obliteration of all religions. The strategy parallels Plan B for NATO. Destroy Catholicism by leading it into cooperative ventures with the Masonic one world syncretic religion. And this would merge Catholic beliefs with atheism or paganism, so it would no longer be Catholicism. Along those lines, Gorbachev himself co-founded the One World Church, which is a spiritual branch of the United Nations and is called the United Religions, UR, or the United Religions Initiative, URI. Its charter was signed in June 2000. Its literature says the organization is a tool for social transformation, which is another term for restructuring. At present, the United Religions is working locally and at the UN to promote daily interfaith cooperation for the good of all life and the healing of the earth. It does this by bringing people from all religions and of all ages, many youth are involved, to work together on projects promoting feminism, environmentalism, disarmament, and a stronger UN. The UR is supported by many priests, nuns, even some bishops, and incredibly and even sadly, it was endorsed by Mother Teresa. I did write to her to double-check on that, and she never contradicted that fact. Perhaps, however, after I wrote to her, I hope her endorsement, she got rid of it, but I never heard anything more about it. Another co-founder of the UR is the syncretic organization World Conference on Religion and Peace, which was launched by Catholic bishops, has a strong Catholic membership and papal support. Pope John Paul spoke at its conference in the Vatican in November 1994, which was the first interfaith assembly ever held at the Holy See. The Vatican uses the World Conference on Religion and Peace as an unofficial liaison with interfaith groups. Since the organization is Gorbachev's partner in co-founding the One World Church, we see how far the errors of Russia have penetrated the church thanks to the Perestroika deception. It's clearly part of the diabolical disorientation that Sister Lucy mentioned indicated would even take over the clergy. Another vivid indication that the policy of restructuring the church is working was Gorbachev giving a speech at the Vatican in November 2000. This man is an avowed Marxist-Leninist. His forums feature occultism. He wants to eliminate 90% of the world's population. He is coordinating the infrastructure of the New World Order. He instigated the policy of restructuring. In other words, the chief representative of the kingdom of Satan on earth addressed the head of God's kingdom on earth and the world's political leaders as an honored and wise guest. Gorbachev also met with Pope John Paul at least a half a dozen times since 1989. So Gramsci's strategy of perverting Catholicism is in full swing because the enemy is not recognized. The religion of God is being replaced with the religion of man as the church is firmly taken, to the road of interfaith dialogue. So this has led her away from working for man's eternal happiness to working for a naturalistic utopia. It has facilitated communist control of de-Christianized minds. Golitsyn assesses the consequences of religious détente as follows. Never in its history since Nero has Christianity faced such a threat of possible destruction. A clear sign that restructuring of the West has succeeded was President Bush's speech to Congress on September 20th, 2001, just after 9/11. Declaring war on terrorists, he referred to the murderous ideologies of the 20th century: fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. What's missing in the list? Communism. He didn't even mention it. The most murderous ideology and the greatest terrorist organization that the world has ever seen, and he never mentioned it. It's not too surprising, given that Bush's family, as I mentioned yesterday, starting with his grandfather Preston, has been involved with developing the Soviet Union, the Nazis, and Communist China. Further, George Bush Sr. was present at Gorbachev's 1995 State of the World Forum Assembly, at which it was decided that Christianity is mostly to blame for the population dilemma, and so 90% of the world's population had to be cut. He blamed Christianity, they blamed Christianity, and there were many other world leaders there, including the ex-Prime Minister of Canada, Margaret Thatcher, and others. James Baker, who was the Secretary of State for George Bush Sr., and Colin Powell, who worked in both administrations, have been associated with Gorbachev's forums as well, as chairmen, as speakers, and so forth. So no wonder President Bush did not mention communism. Now, for the masses to want world government, they must feel that there are problems that allegedly only world government can solve and eliminate. Nuclear annihilation was the first fear until the end of the Cold War. Overpopulation and environmental degradation then took over as threats, and I say threats, but the new threat is international terrorism, and the attacks on the US were a first salvo in this war of psychological warfare. Regardless of who's responsible, the result already is curtailment of civil liberties and international military, financial, and political cooperation, all of which is necessary for the totalitarian world state. There are many, many syncretic memorial services now that have united people also in practicing the one world Masonic religion of indifferentism, which is the state religion of the new world state. In 1969, Dr. Richard Day, formerly National Medical Director of Planned Parenthood, stated, "Everything is in place and nobody can stop us now in controlling population." Amongst the plans he outlined for this were the morals revolution. We have that. A new world religion brought about by the churches themselves. We have that. More airplane and rail accidents, as well as building and bridge collapses, to create an atmosphere of instability. And finally, terrorism would be used to make people demand international controls. He said this in 1969. There could be other strategic reasons for the September 11 attacks, one of which is oil. On June 26th of that year, 2001, an Indian news website reported that India, Iran, and Russia wanted to supply oil and gas to South Asia through India, but instability in Afghanistan was preventing this. After meetings involving Colin Powell, it was decided that if economic sanctions didn't bend Afghanistan, then India, Iran, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan would facilitate US and Russian military action against the Taliban. This was decided in June, and it happened. The chilling thing is that in June of 2001, the US couldn't justify attacking the Taliban. But in October, it had the support of most of the world. Refuting the common Catholic belief that Russia has converted, the secular media for several years now have been reporting on its return to dictatorship, especially under President Putin. There have also been many exposés about corruption and crime in Russia. More than 70% of Russia's economy is tied to organized crime. The Russian mafia has looted billions from the new republics, enabling it to operate in more than 50 countries. In North America, by 1999, there were 30 Russian crime syndicates, and money laundering through American banks even involved Yeltsin and his family. The Catholic Church in Russia and China is, of course, not free. And the Russian Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow has publicly condemned the cult of violence and lechery which has arisen as the result of the rise of neo-paganism, black magic, and occultists. Russia's murder rate is one of the highest in the world. Sexually transmitted diseases are reaching near epidemic scale. And about 7 million abortions are done each year. Gorbachev himself is a New Age occultist, and there's a lot of occult activity at his conferences, which are attended by world leaders. The story is the same across the former Iron Curtain countries. Even Poland has legalized abortion and provides sex education in schools and subsidized contraceptives. Now, if all this is what Our Lady meant by conversion, then all I can say is heaven's moral standards have slipped terribly. Obviously not, that's absurd. But it's not Our Lady's Immaculate Heart, the model of purity and obedience to God. That's what's meant by immaculate, the model of purity and obedience to God. But it's the Perestroika deception that's triumphant today. But the temporary period of deception looks like it's about to come to an end as an economically stronger Russia gets closer to revealing her true face thanks to American provocation. In 1963, President Kennedy reacted to Soviet accusations that American imperialist circles wanted to wage preventive war against the Soviets and achieve world domination through aggressive wars. Even the European and capitalist countries were to be transformed into obedient tools of the Americans and used against socialist countries. Kennedy declared that the peace that the US sought was not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American warfare. Unfortunately, those Soviet accusations from 1963 have now become American policy thanks to the Bushes. In 1997, several members of the administrations of both presidents formed an organization called Project for a New American Century. The founders included Vice President Dick Cheney, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, who was the present president's brother and governor of Florida, and other government officials and prominent Americans. In 2000, this organization, Project for a New American Century, released a blueprint for the military strategy needed for the US to rule the New World Order. Its stated goal is a Pax Americana based on American military might. The blueprint was actually drafted in 1992, and it called for preemptive force to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival. The final 2000 version made it clear that not even a European army could be allowed, so the American military presence in Europe had to be strengthened. The blueprint called for a global missile defense shield against so-called rogue states, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, and also called for the weaponization of space in order to maintain nuclear superiority. The blueprint said only a new Pearl Harbor event could justify the new war doctrine. Very conveniently, the new Pearl Harbor event occurred exactly a year later on September the 11th, 2001. President Bush then launched his preventive war on terror against the rogue states and said the US would also construct a global missile shield. So the US withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty because that forbade both the global missile shield and the weaponization of space. So the US withdrew from it, and it's now working towards installing parts of the shield in former Soviet satellite countries, Poland and the Czech Republic. Finally, as per the Soviet accusations of 1963, the US has started to turn its allies against Russia through a war of words, just like it did with Saddam Hussein. Just 2 days after 9/11, then Secretary of State Colin Powell labeled Saddam one of the leading terrorists on the face of the earth. The false link between Saddam's dictatorial actions in his own country and global terrorism was used to justify the Iraq War after the weapons of mass destruction claim fell apart. In early 2001, the US started the same tactics with Russia as it did with Saddam. The government said the global missile shield was necessary because Russia was helping America's enemies to develop nuclear arsenals. Condoleezza Rice went as far as calling Russia the principal threat to the world today. Before the 1991 Gulf War, George Bush Sr. gave Saddam a choice between war over his invasion of Kuwait or cooperative membership in the New World Order. Of course, Saddam refused, and we know what happened to him. In 2006, referring to Putin's increasing totalitarianism, Vice President Cheney gave Russia the choice between becoming an enemy or joining the one world community. So Russia naturally sees the parallels with Iraq and knows the American plan for world domination. So it started to react. It accuses the states of targeting it, not the so-called rogue states, with the missile shield. It has retaliated with its own belligerent name-calling. I think it's calling the American administration a Nazi administration. It is doing testing of nuclear-capable missiles, and it said it was able to test a missile able to pierce a missile shield. And it is signaling that it would upgrade its nuclear forces. Further, employing cooperation blackmail, Putin threatened to aim ballistic missiles at US bases in Europe if the US went ahead with the shield. That's the blackmail. Whilst also offering to work with the US together on a joint missile shield against common enemies. That's the cooperation. But with no satisfactory American response so far, Russia has temporarily suspended participation in the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which has limited conventional weapons and troop deployments. So that means now it can expand its military range anywhere it feels. Just last week, Putin revived long-range bomber flights beyond Russia's borders to areas patrolled by NATO and the United States. And just recently, I think it was at the start of the month, Russia alleged it had planted its flag under the North Pole, claiming a large area around the pole, which is very rich in oil and gas and minerals, as Russian territory. And it published a video of supposed Russian submarines under the ice. But that was an absolute fake, because that video, that film, was lifted, stolen from the movie Titanic. So who knows if a flag was planted? Nobody's seen it. In any case, a flag doesn't give ownership. But the Arctic bordering nations, Canada, the US, and other nations, are now rushing to the North Pole to certify their territorial claims under international law, as it seems Putin wants the West to depend upon it for oil and gas. In a world weary of war, psychopolitics has reactivated the stimulus of possible nuclear annihilation that had been on the back burner for some years. And now we see a dangerous con game of brinkmanship being acted out between Putin and Bush so that the world will clamor for international cooperation and further global controls, which is the way to world government and the peace that it promises. But will it be a Pax Americana? Or will it be the communist world state? It doesn't matter. Both are puppets of the Masonic forces that will rule the Luciferian world state. But we do have a hint. Our Lady warned that it would be Russia that was chosen, because Russia was chosen as God's instrument of chastisement. Russia is alleged to have the world's largest stockpile of operational nuclear weapons. You know, it only takes one or two to wipe out a big country like the United States, but it has the largest stockpile of operational nuclear weapons and thousands of warheads aimed at North America. Golitsyn said, "The sword of Damocles is hanging over Western democracies, yet they are oblivious to it." He warned that convergence with Russia will bring bloodbaths and re-education camps. Well, it took only 10 years of partial convergence following the disbanding of the USSR before the bloodbaths of the past 6 years commenced in 2001. We're having bloodbaths, say, in countries like Iraq. In 1920, Pope Benedict XV warned of an imminent world state that would be a reign of unheard-of terror because it would banish the authority of God. Our Lady of Fatima said peace would be obtained only through the collegial consecration of Russia and its subsequent conversion. And one of the punishments for disobeying her would be the annihilation of nations. She's been disobeyed for 78 years. And annihilation through human means is becoming more feasible every day. It may happen by another way, but anyhow, by human means, it is becoming more feasible. Time is running out for church authorities to heed her request and save civilization. We must earn the grace for that crucial consecration. And to do that, may all Catholics follow Our Lady's program of prayer and penance, never forgetting her words, "Only I can help you." Thank you very much for your time.